When discussing security policy or major international events like the war in Ukraine, often a lot of attention focuses on major powers. Doing so might make a degree of sense, but I think it also misses the massive potential impact that smaller nations can have, as well as the tremendous strategic challenge that can come with being a relatively small nation with some very powerful neighbours. The three Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, between them have a population of just over 6 million. They sit on the extreme eastern edge of the NATO alliance and bordering Russia, Belarus and Kaliningrad, aren't exactly in the most low-risk neighbourhood. But despite, or perhaps because of, their limited resources and precarious strategic position, the Baltic states have been some of Ukraine's louder supporters and most generous donors. They're also a fascinating point of study when it comes to defence strategy, basically having to ask, how do you come up with a way to deter Russia, despite having a smaller combined population than Riyadh or Rio? And so today, we're going to talk about them. So as usual, I'll start with a bit of history and then work forward to the modern strategic environment of the Baltic states. I'll go over their geographic position, resources, perceived threats, and ask why all those perceived threats seem to rhyme with Usher. Then we'll look at the defensive strategies and forces they developed to answer that potential threat. That'll mean looking at the militaries of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, their various modernisation plans, and the immense focus they place on collective defence. That'll lead into a final section where we look at two major recent events and what they've meant for the Baltic states, namely the expansion of the NATO membership and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the governments of the Baltic states have at once been some of the most generous donors and loudest supporting voices. But before we jump into some Baltic history, first a word from a sponsor. And today I'm welcoming back a returning sponsor and my preferred VPN, Private Internet Access. Hopefully we can all agree that the internet's a pretty amazing thing and we've come a long way from dial-up modems and paying for connections by the hour. But our online and data-driven world can also be highly transparent, prone to the occasional data breach or privacy threat, and subject to a degree of fragmentation as nations and companies change their rules and restrictions. To operate in that environment, you probably want the right combination of tools, practices, and preparation. Think of it like all the safety briefings and equipment you'll see on a plane. Unless you're in a MiG-21 unit, you might fly your entire life without ever needing any of that stuff. But you're still probably very happy it's there. On the internet, being prepared might mean watching where you browse, using strong passwords, and maybe adding a VPN. With a click, a VPN allows you to reroute your internet traffic and change your public IP address. Plus, there's the question of how your traffic is recorded. Private Internet Access has a stated policy of not logging user activity, which has reportedly been both audited and tested in court. If you're worried about fragmentation, when you connect, you'll see they have servers in more than 91 countries, which lets you pick, to an extent, the version of the internet you see. Plus, the VPN is advertised as being compatible with a range of streaming services, available cross-platform. They even have an Apple TV app now. And you might actually be able to take advantage of that cross-platform availability because a single subscription enables you to cover an unlimited number of devices. So if you are interested, there is a link in the description which will give you a discount of 83% on a 2-year subscription plus 4 bonus months, covering, as I said, an unlimited number of devices. So please feel free to check it out, and with my thanks to Private Internet Access, let's get back to it. Okay, so as always, before we start digging into strategy and economics, we have to start with some history. And I'd argue that a lot of the history of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia has been guided by their unique geography. Valuable in terms of their positioning on the Baltic Sea, but also vulnerable in terms of the neighbours they've often had to keep. In the modern day, for example, before Finland's accession to NATO, the Baltic states represented the extreme northeast edge of the alliance. Estonia and Latvia have borders with Russia proper, with Estonia actually being a relatively short drive from St. Petersburg, which has the distinction of being Russia's second largest city, home to some gorgeous historical buildings, and the headquarters of an entire Russian military district. Lithuania doesn't border Russia proper directly, but it does border the enclave of Kaliningrad, formerly Königsberg, to the west, and Belarus to the east, which obviously matters given that Belarus has more than a little recent form when it comes to allowing Russian troops to march through their countries for the purpose of getting somewhere else. Then, compared to all that border with Russia, the land link back to the rest of NATO is actually very narrow. A relatively small strip of land connecting Lithuania with a NATO centre of gravity in Poland. So if you're leaving Scandinavia out of this picture, a lot of these Baltic states are a lot closer to Russia than they are to potential help. And while the politics of the time are often different, if you look back through history, you'll see just how often that geographical position has shaped the history of these countries. It's always hard to encapsulate the entire history of a country into a couple of minutes, and with 3 countries, it's basically impossible. So for the sake of time today, I'm mostly going to start in the 20th century. But I think it's important to acknowledge up front that Latvians, Lithuanians and Estonians are all distinct people with their own languages and cultures and long histories. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, for example, was a major European power for a significant period of time. Its personal union with Poland created the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was a major European power for centuries and had a number of features that were way ahead of their time, like some legally entrenched civil liberties and a deeply polarised and dysfunctional parliament. Commonwealth troops also took Moscow in 1610, although I'm not sure if the modern Lithuanian military claims any right to that particular battle honour. At the beginning of the 20th century, however, modern Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia were all within the territorial boundaries of the Russian Empire. Their opportunities for independence then would come with the defeat and collapse of the Russian Empire in World War I. This was not, as you might expect, a smooth process. Many in the Baltic States were, for example, quick to declare independence as soon as Russian troops began withdrawing, only for Imperial German troops to turn up shortly thereafter and tell them the whole independence thing was definitely cancelled. Or at least it was cancelled until Germany was subsequently defeated and the independence thing was back on. But only, it seemed, if the young nations were willing to fight for it. None of the three states needed to wait particularly long between declaring independence and fighting a war to establish that independence. For example, Germany would hand over power to the provisional government in Estonia on the 19th of November 1918. That new government would have just over a week to get used to their new jobs before the Soviets invaded on the 28th of November. The chaotic details of the often multi-party wars of independence that followed could occupy entire episodes. But for now, it's enough to say that after serious armed struggle, all three Baltic states were able to sign treaties with the Soviet Union that, at least on paper, recognised their sovereignty and independence. These treaties were all deposited with the League of Nations at the time, so you can go read the original text if you like. The treaty with Estonia provided for the unreserved recognition of the independence and sovereignty of the country and, quote, renounces voluntarily and forever all sovereign rights possessed by Russia over the Estonian people and territory, end quote. The Lithuanian-Soviet Treaty likewise recognised Lithuanian independence, including some territories that weren't actually controlled by Lithuania at the time, which is a whole other story. And the Treaty of Riga, which provided for Latvia's independence, recognised the independence of that country, quote, for all future time, end quote. Unfortunately for the Baltic states, apparently in Moscow, all future time translates to about 2 decades. In the August of 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, more commonly known in colloquial terms as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The pact included a secret protocol which carved up the territory between Germany and the USSR into spheres of influence, with demarcations covering territories including Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia and Finland. Just over a week after the treaty was signed, Germany would invade Poland and have war declared against it by the Western Allies. Stalin would then order the Soviet invasion of a much weakened Poland about 2.5 weeks later, while avoiding a similar response from Paris and London. Meanwhile, also in 1939, the Soviets requested the Baltic states sign mutual assistance treaties with the Soviet Union. It was clear that the agreements would allow the Soviets to base tens of thousands of troops in Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. It was also very clear that they weren't asking. Later, by mid-1940, with Soviet troops already in place, things escalated further. To greatly simplify the story, the Soviets demanded free movement of their troops into these countries and the establishment of pro-Soviet governments. A process considerably helped by the division's worth of Soviet troops that were already in place. And from there, things played out according to a pattern that I'm sure you've never seen before. First, a bunch of troops arrive and supervise the creation of a new popular government. One that really genuinely represents the will of the local people. Supervised elections were then held in which the opposition weren't allowed to file candidates, miraculously leading to a new government full of people who think that joining the Soviet Union is a fantastic idea. Moscow, of course, had no choice but to recognise the genuinely expressed will of the people of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania and allowed them to join the Soviet Union. On a more serious note, most Western nations didn't recognise these annexations. And the prevailing legal position in much of the world today is that the current Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia are the same countries that were in their view occupied between 1940 and 1991. But with that said, let's jump back to 1940. Stalin being Stalin, a lot of not very YouTube-friendly things would then happen in the Baltic states while they were under Soviet control. The Soviets would then be displaced by another country famous for its benign occupation policies, Nazi Germany, in 1941. The Second World War was then deeply costly for the Baltic states. All three fell under the administrative control of Reichskommissariat Ostland, and many residents of the Baltic states would be killed over the course of the war. Tens of thousands would die, having been mobilised into the Soviet army, units like the 8th Estonian Rifle Corps, or the 308th Latvian Rifle Division, which would go on to win the Order of the Red Banner. Others would be conscripted or volunteer into German formations, where again, casualties were often very heavy. And after all was said and done, the Baltic states ended up basically where they had started, back as part of the Soviet Union. The post-war period saw attempts to more closely integrate the Baltic territories into the broader Soviet Union. Stalin continued to do Stalin things while he was alive, and over the course of many years and many governments, the economies of these states were significantly restructured. Major investments in industry were made, for example, correlated with significant migration of industrial workers from the wider Soviet Union, with Latvia and Estonia in particular seeing significant migration, especially by ethnic Russians. And until the Gorbachev era, the Soviet status quo mostly prevailed. With Gorbachev's reforms, however, it became more acceptable for organisations and individuals to express views that were contrary to the official Soviet narrative. And the Supreme Soviets in Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania began to move to reassert their national identities. In 1988 through 89, they declared their intentions to pursue sovereignty. And while I have to skip over most of the detail of the path towards independence here, I really encourage you to go read up on it. It includes mass protests, legal arguments, attempted military interventions, and a minor logistical exercise known as the Baltic Way, where, by some estimates, between 1 and 2 million Latvians, Lithuanians and Estonians formed a contiguous human chain linking the three capitals. As a side note here, generally speaking, assessing the size of a crowd can be a pretty contentious exercise. But when you shape that crowd into a continuous line over a known distance, it becomes basically impossible to argue that this was just a couple of thousand agitators expressing a niche political opinion. Now, on reflection, it's possible that under different circumstances, the Soviet Union might have applied more military pressure to stop the Baltic states breaking away. And indeed, a number of Lithuanian citizens would be killed in an exchange of fire in early January 1991. But by this point, the sun was thoroughly setting on the Union. Russia was breaking away from the Soviet Union, and that was a rather more important problem to deal with than the Baltic states. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia once again regained their practical independence. And among the many pressing priorities for the governments of those states in the chaotic 1990s was the establishment of a military capability and security strategy that would prevent that independence being short-lived. In some respects, the Baltic states faced a lot more obstacles rebuilding their military capacity than did other former Soviet republics. They didn't, for example, inherit the military-industrial complex, vast arsenal and military educational establishments that Ukraine did. But in a sense, it might be argued that curse was actually a bit of a blessing, because it allowed the Baltic states to start basically from scratch, building a military that was configured to work not with other Soviet militaries, but potentially with Western military partners instead. Veterans of the old Soviet forces were obviously very important, but so too were new voices. The Estonian forces, for example, were commanded for a couple of years by General Alexander Einzeln. Einzeln had been born in Estonia, but lived most of his life in the United States, where he went career army. He fought in Korea, commanded special forces in Vietnam, and retired a colonel in 1985. Now, it's not unusual after people retire for them to get bored and seek out some sort of hobby. Some take up golf, others travel a lot, and some apparently decide to take command of entire militaries. The other element of the new nation's security strategy was to try and find some friends as quickly as humanly possible. That presumably meant shaking off the post-independence party hangover and figuring out how to get into the European Union and NATO. That's something that all three states would ultimately achieve in 2004. But if you want to understand why they pushed so hard to get there and how it continues to shape their strategy to this day, it's probably time to talk about the modern strategic position of the Baltic states, the resources they have, and the challenges they face. And as always, there are three key bits I want to look at here: economics, demographics, and geography. Economically, the story of the Baltic states in the 1990s is probably one you've heard a few times before at this point. Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia had all been integrated into the Soviet planned market economy. So when that system collapsed, the old supply chains broke down and the economies suddenly had to transition towards being market economies with new trade partners, there was initially an enormous amount of pain involved. But you could argue the Baltic states were ultimately better able to effect that transition than many of the other countries trying to do the same thing at basically the same time. For one thing, while they did take very different approaches to the issue of privatising old state-owned enterprises, all three generally avoided the problem of having a couple of oligarchs come in, buy assets for pennies on the dollar, and then monopolise economic and political power. A lot of really valuable human capital was still there. The geographical advantage of where these states were was obviously still the same. So you saw very rapid economic integration with the European economies and sort of a marketing pitch that these countries could act as a bridge between East and West. So after a hard slog post-independence, things got better. In fact, they got much, much better. In 2000, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia were all nations outside the bounds of the European Union with a GDP per capita of under $5,000 per person. Before the global financial crisis hit about 8 years later, they were all European Union members, with GDP per capita about 3 times what it had been just a couple of years earlier. The growth chart for the Baltic Tigers, as they became known, basically looked like a crypto pump and dump scheme, but without the dump. It was just a case of line go up and up and up. The GFC would slow things down, but only for a while. And until the major disruption caused by the February 2022 invasion, the growth story had basically returned. And in the 10 years between 2012 and 2022, all 3 states essentially doubled their GDP per capita in nominal US dollar terms. To put that in perspective, if the USA had managed the same growth rate over that period, GDP per capita would have crossed $100,000 per person back in 2022. Demographically, however, the post-independence period left the Baltic states with a couple of lingering challenges. What you see on the right there is a demographic pyramid for Estonia in 2021. But it could pretty much just as easily be one for Latvia, Lithuania, Russia or Ukraine. Some elements of the basic shape just speak to common historical factors. For example, all those countries have those characteristic inward bulges once you get down below the 30s age group. These are the people who should have been born in the 1990s or early 2000s, but weren't because the 1990s were pretty awful everywhere east of the Elbe River. All 3 states also have challenges with young people particularly travelling to other jurisdictions in the European Union to seek out career opportunities, and all 3 states face significant demographic challenges. But at a big picture level, in the here and now, all 3 of these countries are probably best characterised as advanced economies, albeit ones with small populations. To translate, for any Americans listening, Lithuania has a population of about 2.9 million, about the same as Mississippi, Latvia 1.8 million, West Virginia, and Estonia 1.37 million, about the size of Maine. Collectively, the 3 states have a population north of 6 million, making them larger in population terms than Finland. All 3 have advanced service-based economies, albeit with slightly different twists. And if you're trying to get a sense of where that puts them on the European spectrum, in nominal terms, all 3 are significantly ahead of Russia, still leading Poland, a bit behind Finland, and way, way, way behind Norway. Because no one really ever gets to catch Norway with their $1.6+ trillion sovereign wealth funds. So hey Norway, if you ever find you need yourself an extra defence consultant, let me know. But the essential point here is that economically, the Baltic states have a lot going for them. They're relatively prosperous, high HDI, low corruption jurisdictions, with what organisations like Freedom House assess to be free and fair multi-party democracies, which is not a happy ending that all states in the former Soviet Union or Eastern Bloc got. But while they're blessed with a tremendous economic asset, namely their position on the Baltic Sea, they're also cursed with a tremendous strategic weakness, their position on the Baltic Sea. Added to that is the challenge of not just being in a difficult position geographically, but also being very small countries with limited strategic depth. We talked about the challenge of limited strategic depth in my video on the IDF, so I won't go over all the core concepts here. Instead, it probably suffices to say that none of these countries have a significant geographical buffer between their core economic and populated regions and their borders, either with Russia or that place run by the bloke who really wants Putin to make him a Soviet colonel for some reason. For Estonia, the headquarters of the Leningrad military district is right there, and if you're Lithuania, the situation is so depressing that it's probably funny at this point. Lithuania's capital, Vilnius, is about 40 kilometres from the Belarusian border, meaning there are a significant number of long-range rocket artillery systems in the Russian inventory that could fire on Lithuania's capital without crossing the border. And it wouldn't take that much of an advance to put the capital within range of regular 152mm shell fire. That's not strategic depth, it's a strategic puddle. And it helps explain one reason why the strategic situation of the Baltic states is often perceived as being quite precarious. If you look at how much territory Russia was able to seize in Ukraine in 2022 before the Ukrainians were able to blunt that initial offensive and start throwing it back, then an equivalent achievement in the Baltics would leave them basically overrun. The Russians obviously didn't manage to take Kyiv, but Vilnius is much closer to the border than Kyiv was. And keeping all of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia's critical infrastructure and settlements out of the range of most Russian weapon systems would mean pushing most Russian forces far, far back from their own border. It's just the unfortunate geographic reality of how these countries are shaped and where they're positioned. Which brings us to the question of strategic thinking and defence policy in the Baltic States. How do they perceive their threat environment, and how do they propose to answer it? As we've discussed in the past, before you get to strategy, often a country will start with an understanding of its strategic environment, its threats and its objectives. And in terms of the Baltic States, post-collapse of the Soviet Union, the source of any potential perceived threat may not have changed, Russia has always been there, but how serious that threat is, and the way it's described, has in some cases shifted over time. If you read Lithuania's military strategy from 2012, for example, pre-invasion of Crimea, it can feel like looking through a window into a distant and long-lost world. The document outright says, for example, quote, "At present, Lithuania does not face any direct military threat," end quote. However, even at that point, there were some dubiously deniable notes of caution. It referred, for example, to unspecified non-democratic states with, quote, "an alarmingly increasing military power and stronger tendencies to demonstrate it," end quote, that remained, quote, "in the close security environment of Lithuania," end quote. It would also note the threat of growing authoritarianism in unnamed neighbouring eastern countries, and the increasing military power of those states. Now, I don't know if you remember your maps from earlier, but if you are talking about a militarily powerful, increasingly authoritarian state in Lithuania's close security environment to its east, you probably don't need to be a geoguesser genius to figure out they probably weren't talking about the Mongolians going back on the warpath. But you get the picture. Some of these documents were cloaked in the language of deniability. They were a little bit coy. And you'll occasionally see references to things like building trust between those eastern neighbours and NATO. But if you jump forward to 2024, you might notice a subtle change or two in the language now being used. Latvia's defence minister has outright said, quote, "Our international threats will not change, they are based in Russia," end quote. He also referred to the danger of Russia restoring its military potential after Ukraine, which meant, quote, "increasing threats and risks for the Baltic region and NATO's eastern flank," end quote. Latvia's foreign minister, by contrast, is reported to have said, in reference to Russia's war in Ukraine, that, quote, "Russia will not stop, Russia can only be stopped," end quote. Estonia's national defence concept from 2023 went a step further and used the language of existential threat, saying, quote, "The greatest security threat to Estonia is the Russian Federation, whose objective is to dismantle and rewrite Europe's security architecture and the rules-based international order, and to restore the politics of spheres of influence. The threat to Estonia based on these objectives is an existential one. The Russian Federation has repeatedly carried out acts of aggression, occupying, annexing, and committing war crimes on the territory of neighbouring countries. The threat the Russian Federation poses to Estonia is a long-term one," end quote. As far as official documents go, that is about as blunt as it is possible to be. But in military terms, what might that threat be, and how might it manifest itself? If you're trying to assess the potential existence of a hypothetical military threat, sometimes I think you could do worse than to borrow a framework from, of all places, criminal law, by asking first whether a potential attacker has a motive to launch some sort of operation, and secondly, whether they have the means to do so. After that, you can start trying to assess potential deterrence or model their strategic calculus, but let's stick with the first two at the moment. First, are there potentially motives for Russia to attempt some sort of military action in the Baltic States? The answer is almost certainly yes. Firstly, these are territories that were once part of the Soviet Union and before that the Russian Empire. We know Putin is very big on historical claims, so I am personally looking forward to Crimea being returned to the Tatars or the Greeks, while Mongolia gets ready for some serious territorial expansion. But jokes aside, we still sometimes see Russian political leaders use the language of ownership with reference to the Baltic States. In 2023, for example, Medvedev reportedly described the Baltic States as ours, and Poland as temporarily occupied. Yes, that might be bravado, but so too were a lot of the claims on Ukraine until suddenly they weren't. Taking over one or more of the Baltic states would enlarge Russia's economy, expand its borders, and generally align with a vision of Russia reclaiming, in inverted commas, its old borders. The Baltic states also have a significant ethnic Russian minority, with ethnic Russians making up more than 20% of the population in Estonia and Latvia. If you remember the reasons Russia gave for its various military operations in Ukraine, the protection, in inverted commas, of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers was often near the top of the list. So even if ethnic Russians in the Baltic states have absolutely no interest in joining the Russian Federation, their existence might provide a motive or a casus belli for a potential Russian operation. Finally, another motive might have very little to do with the Baltic states themselves, with the goal instead being able to find a way to militarily challenge NATO by picking on what Russia might perceive to be a relatively soft target. And it's that part of the discussion where you start to shift from motive to means. A fight in the Baltic states would in many ways play to Russia's military strengths. It would be launching an attack relatively close to some of its major supply bases, within range of a lot of its pre-sighted long-range missile and air defence systems, and not have to go too far from that air defence or logistics bubble in order to overrun the potential objectives. Information warfare and diplomacy are also an aspect of any potential campaign, and there might be reasons for Russia to sense some weakness when it comes to the Baltic states. And mostly these revolve around what you might call the post-Soviet status problem. In terms of language, describing the Baltic states as post-Soviet states is in some ways useful shorthand. I use it myself sometimes to delineate a state that used to be under the control of the Soviet Union. But you'll find more than a few people in Latvia, Lithuania or Estonia who aren't big fans of the term. In the same way some in the Balkans might object to the term former Yugoslav or post-Yugoslav states. Part of the potential objection is that you're defining a country with reference to an old geopolitical structure where a foreign capital was at the centre. And that might lead to concerns that you're selling short the sovereignty and independence that these states now enjoy. In 2023, for example, there was a significant diplomatic incident when the Chinese ambassador to France basically appeared to undermine the sovereignty of the Baltic states in a TV interview. The ambassador was quoted as saying, quote, "Even these ex-Soviet Union countries do not have effective status, as we say, under international law, because there's no international accord to concretise their status as a sovereign country," end quote. The Chinese government basically immediately walked back those comments and confirmed their recognition of the sovereignty of the Baltic states. But if you were planning a Russian information warfare operation, you might look at circumstances like this and think that there might be something to leverage here. And one fear of planners in the Baltic states might be that leaders in other countries would be less likely to stand up and help defend them if they think of them less as truly independent and sovereign states, and more just post-Soviet entities over which Moscow still has some sort of interest. So while a lot of militaries, think tanks and research groups have generally come to the conclusion that even before the invasion of Ukraine, a Russian attack on the Baltic states wasn't particularly likely, in significant part because if Russia were to attempt it, there was a non-zero chance of the Baltic states hitting the Article 5 button and Russia getting its face kicked in by NATO, this is a scenario that has received a lot of public study and speculation. Some of that speculation has focused on points of potential geographic vulnerability. The Suwalki Gap, for example, is a narrow band of territory that links the Baltic states to Poland in the south. And so were Russia ever to seize control of that strip, it would both sever the Baltic states from quick land-based reinforcements from the south, while also linking Kaliningrad to Belarus. Russian state TV basically showed off a plan to do exactly that, with retired Colonel Igor Korotchenko showing off a plan that involved the occupation of the corridor and also the landing of Russian troops on the Swedish island of Gotland. That scenario as presented obviously ended in a complete Russian victory. But that general subject of a Russian move against the Baltics has also been subject to some more grounded writings and simulations. In 2014 and 15, for example, RAND ran a series of war games simulating a Russian attack on the Baltic states. Those games were obviously built around certain assumptions as to the capacity of Russian military formations that were in vogue at the time, as well as the strength of NATO forces in the region, which were much lower than they are today. For example, in the modelled scenario, Russia had a nearly 2-to-1 advantage in manoeuvre battalions and a crushing advantage in armour and fires, with not a single NATO main battle tank being present. Now, those wargames weren't uncontroversial, and they represent the assumptions of a different time. But the unambiguous conclusion of most of RAND's simulations was that Russia would be able to make significant progress, reaching the capitals of some of the Baltic states in, at most, 60 hours. An interesting note here is that when you see news coverage of the potential of a Russian invasion of the Baltic, whether that be on Russian state TV or in Western media, often it does focus on that Suwalki Gap, with the underlying assumption being that Russia would launch a rapid offensive, trying to link up with Kaliningrad, and then go from there. But I think there's a chance here to make a quick and potentially timely reminder that just because a scenario is the most discussed, that doesn't mean it's the only one to plan for. The Russian invasion of Ukraine looked very different to what most observers were publicly anticipating. And there's no reason to think that a Baltic scenario couldn't likewise flip the anticipated script. When RAND ran its war games, sometimes the Red Force commanders did attempt a Suwalki Gap strategy, but as the write-up on those war games observed, over time the Red Force commanders actually came to favour attacks against Estonia and Latvia rather than a strike through Lithuania. Yes, that meant that Kaliningrad had to operate without a land bridge, but at the same time, there were a lot of other advantages. Russian forces were operating very close to their supply bases and jumping off points. St. Petersburg was right there. NATO forces would have to operate further away from their centres of gravity in Poland, and NATO aircraft would have considerably farther to fly to impact the battlefield. Russian forces could also effectively operate under the umbrella of their existing air defence systems. And the result, as the report described it, was usually that Russian forces were knocking on the gates of Tallinn and Riga in 2 to 3 days. From there, as the report writers noted, Russia would have something valuable to bargain with. And from there, potentially, by ramping up the pressure, perhaps announcing annexations of the new territory or threatening nuclear annihilation, the Russian military could put NATO, which was still pulling together its forces, in a difficult position. Because while NATO in this scenario would no doubt have the overall military resources to defeat Russia, if it chose to do so, what it might be missing is a way to do it quickly and cheaply without significantly damaging the Baltic States or risking escalation. And that basic quandary applies to some extent to all of the 3 basic responses that the report explored. NATO could call the Russian bluff, so to speak, and launch a costly conventional campaign to blast the Russians out of the Baltic States and back into Russian territory, but that would rely on the cohesion of the alliance holding together, and power centres like Berlin, Paris and Washington being willing to risk potential Russian escalation in order to honour that Article 5 commitment with concerted offensive action. Another option would be to channel some Cold War era or modern French nuclear doctrine, basically threatening Russia with a nuclear escalation if it didn't withdraw from the Baltics. That strategy played on the point that, after all, NATO has nukes too, more of them than Russia in fact, but in order to work, it would depend on Russia perceiving that nuclear threat as credible. Meanwhile, the final option would be to let things settle down, have a ceasefire, and essentially freeze or bake in at least some Russian gains. That would obviously then spare the risk of further military escalation right then and there, but it also might represent a Russian victory of sorts in more way than one. Take a step back for a moment and think about this in terms of rational strategic calculus. And I know it's always folly to assume that national leaders will always be rational. There are significant parts of human history that stand as direct evidence to the contrary, but let's leave that aside for a moment. If you're Russia and thinking about invading the Baltic States just to get the land bridge to Kaliningrad, the risk calculus just doesn't make sense. If NATO chooses to respond, then effectively you have a choice between conventional military defeat and nuclear annihilation. And in exchange for taking that massive strategic gamble, you get to maybe save yourself a customs check every time you drive to Kaliningrad. Frankly, choosing to base jump into a minefield probably has a better ratio between risk and reward at that point. But that statement ignores the fact that the real prize might not be the territory taken, but the weakening of Article 5 itself. If NATO backs down, hesitates, or leaves the Baltic states to their fate, then the credibility of the organisation as a defensive alliance is pretty much done at that point. Creating effective deterrence using an alliance structure usually relies on pledging to defend each other's countries, not pledging to do so if it happens to be easy and convenient. A successful challenge to NATO's Article 5 might be a threat to the integrity of NATO, American alliance structures in the Asia-Pacific, and potentially an incentive for countries to cease their reliance on the US nuclear umbrella and instead favour the development of their own domestic nuclear weapons. Even a fragmentation where some NATO countries chose to respond to a threat and others didn't might not destroy the credibility of the organisation in the same way, but it might effectively shrink it and its military capacity. And if you're Russia, and the prize potentially on the table is undermining the very cohesion and integrity of NATO itself, maybe a potentially idiotic decision just becomes a stupidly foolhardy one. And if you're the Baltic states and have been watching all of Russia's strategic decision-making for the last decade or so, you might be reasonably concerned that stupid is a long way from impossible. Okay, so that's the potential threat, and not a particularly small one. The next strategic question then is, how do you, as 3 very small nations, try and defend against it? And here, even though these are 3 distinct countries, I think it makes sense to look at them together, because they all face broadly similar threats and limitations. You could argue they're all playing basically the same challenge scenario, and as a result, you see some common themes and answers. The need for conventional military capability, societal and economic resilience in the face of a threat, and the embrace of the idea of collective defence. Expressed another way, they need guns, they need friends, and a society that's ready to face the storm. And here we'll start with conventional defence, because while each of these countries puts a lot of emphasis on collective security, which we'll get to in a moment, they're also major spenders, in percentage of GDP terms, on their own domestic militaries. In each case, that aligns with their public strategy documents. Latvia says it has 4 pillars of national defence: the armed forces, the social aspects of total defence, collective defence, and international cooperation. For Estonia, there are different aspects of security policy, with military defence being one of them, and you can find no shortage of strong language in some of the Lithuanian documents. And the results of that spending, reflective of that focus, are some pretty punchy home defence militaries. If you've watched some of my previous videos, the Estonian military bears at least a passing resemblance to the Finnish model. The standing force is comparatively tiny, about 7,000 personnel, with the majority being in the army. But a lot of that structure is just there to provide training for new conscript intakes and cadre for mobilisation. In the event of mobilisation, the initial mobilised strength for the force is about 43,000, and then according to the Estonian government, beyond that 43,000, there's a further 40,000 reservists who have undergone training but aren't assigned to a specific wartime posting. So think people who might be readily available to serve as replacements or to stand up new units, while the wider mobilisation pool of everyone who's liable to be called up is about 250,000 people, roughly 20% of the overall population. Which, to put that in perspective, would be equivalent to the US mobilising something like 66 million people. In terms of equipment and structuring, this is primarily an infantry or mechanised infantry force. The Estonians reportedly have 44 of the excellent CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles, about 140 APCs, some short-range air defence systems, and a small park of artillery. As a side note here, I know I promised that I would use the military balance equipment estimates, as is, to enable better comparisons between videos. But here, I am going to tack on a significant asterisk because it matters. Military Balance 2024 says that Estonia has 56 howitzers, 18 Korean K9 self-propelled guns, and 36 old D-30 howitzers. But Estonia reportedly pledged those D-30s to Ukraine, has publicly stated that at least some of them have already been transferred, and has even claimed cash reimbursement from the European Peace Facility for some of those howitzers. So I think it's fair to estimate that, as of now, those figures are probably an overestimate of Estonia's available artillery firepower. As for the Navy, that's patrol and coastal combatants only, while the Air Force doesn't have any combat aircraft. Basically, this is a force that can mobilise quickly, dig in, and hold until relieved. The Latvian military has some similar themes to it, although it is somewhat smaller. Like Estonia, the country already spends considerably more than 2% of GDP on defence, $1.1 billion equivalent in 2023, and that figure is expected to grow. That spending supports an active strength of about 7,000, a 16,000 strong reserve component, and a broader mobilisation pool that is expected to expand now that the country has brought back military conscription. In terms of military equipment, you've got 170 FV-107 fighting vehicles, 34 APCs, 59 M109 self-propelled guns, a navy that once again has to content itself with patrol and coastal combatants only, and an air force that once again doesn't have any combat aircraft. Finally, Lithuania, as the largest of the 3 countries, also has the largest defence budget, about $1.9 billion in US dollar terms in 2023. Their expenditure is about 2.5% of GDP, on its way towards 3%, and that supports an active duty strength of about 25,000, with, depending on what you count, about another 25,000 in reserve. Military Balance gets that figure by counting the active Army Reserve, the Rifleman Union, and the State Border Guard Service. In terms of military equipment, at this point you might be starting to suspect that all the Baltic States basically downloaded the same military template and then applied slightly different cosmetic packs to it. Because once again, this is a predominantly mechanised infantry force with a little bit of supporting artillery. Lithuania has about 90 infantry fighting vehicles, about 240 APCs, mostly older M113s, a small force of Javelin-equipped Humvees, an artillery force composed of a couple of batteries of PZH-2000s from Germany, and this time not just short-range air defences, but some medium-range ones as well. But there the distinction once again collapses because the Navy has only patrol and coastal combatants and the Air Force doesn't have any combat aircraft. And at this point you are almost certainly starting to notice a theme. Namely, these are armed forces that concentrate very heavily on just a couple of key capabilities. If you're a significant military power, like France, the United States, China or India, you might be able to try to do a little bit of everything. But the smaller and smaller your nation and budget gets, the harder and harder decisions you have to make when it comes to prioritisation. Just about everyone that isn't the US, Russia, or China skips out on strategic bombers. A nation like Finland, focused on homeland defence, might skip on the Blue Water Navy and the logistics required to project power overseas. But if you're dealing with budgets so small they can all fit within a single Pentagon accounting error, you have to get ruthless. So the Baltic states don't just ditch the bling, they have to skip a lot of the basics too. None of them have long-range air defences, price tag too big and country too small. And at the moment at least, none of them even have tanks. Instead, what they have is a lot of stuff that answers three basic questions. What's the stuff that is cheap, holds territory, and can't be readily and quickly deployed by allies? And the predominant answer to that question is a lot of infantry with some anti-tank weapons and artillery that are able to quickly mobilise, dig in, and then stubbornly refuse to move. Things like aircraft are too expensive, but also too easy for allies to deploy. There's nothing stopping you flying combat missions from bases in Germany or Poland, for example, within minutes or hours of some sort of Baltic crisis breaking out. But getting infantry and armoured formations to the Baltic is probably going to take longer. You need to ready the units, organise the logistics, tell the Poles to stop celebrating the fact they're about to go fight the Russians, and then make it all happen. So it makes sense for the Baltic states to invest in making sure they have at least some of those ground combat elements in place and ready to mobilise at short notice. Since February 2022, however, all the Baltic capitals had a little bit of an oh shit moment, and as a result, the militaries have just a bit more budget to play with. And a lot of that will go into scaling existing capabilities and also adding new ones. In terms of scale, Latvia wants to significantly increase the size of its active and reserve forces, and there's also finally some room in these budgets for a few more interesting capabilities too. The Lithuanians might want to go back into tanks, with the Lithuanian army reportedly asking for 54. Estonia is buying anti-ship missiles, self-propelled guns from Korea, and HIMARS from the United States. There are joint procurements for medium-range air defence systems in the works, and the only one of these three countries which had phased out conscription, Latvia. They've now brought it back, along with a plan to increase the size of the country's military. And you can argue it will sort of bring the Latvian military in line with another principle that sort of flows through a lot of Baltic defence policy. And that's the idea, often presented in different ways but commonly expressed, of total defence and mobilisation. If you're interested in reading further into this concept, I have done a video on defence strategy for small nations before, but the basic principle here is that when you're a small nation under a significant threat, there is exactly zero room for chill or restraint in your defence planning. You need to make sure that you are as painful, as unappetising a target as possible, and that means making sure that in the event of war, all of your national resources are ready for and committed to solving that problem. Lithuanian policy probably expresses the idea pretty succinctly. Quote, "The essential principle of Lithuania's defence is total defence, which means that all resources are mobilised for Lithuania's defence and all means, both military and non-military, are used." End quote. It might sound fairly extreme, but the idea is to make sure that every citizen, every business, knows where they fit into the country's defence planning. And that even if the country can't quickly pull together an army capable of beating the Russians head-on, if you have a plan for putting enough anti-tank weapons into enough hands quickly enough, then maybe the fear of going through Kiev syndrome all over again might provide something of a deterrent. And if it doesn't, maybe being part of the most powerful military alliance that planet Earth has ever seen just might. Which brings us to the next pillar of Baltic security strategy, collective security and the special role of NATO. NATO as a whole is a pretty diverse organisation. The nations and the people within it have different views as to its future and its importance. Bulgaria, for example, has a relatively NATO-sceptic population, with 2023 survey results showing that Bulgarians who wanted to stay in NATO only outnumber those who would consider leaving by about 1.5 to 1, with that being the lowest ratio of any nation in the alliance. In Latvia, by contrast, the ratio was 6 to 1, in Estonia 9 to 1, and in Lithuania almost 11 to 1. Recognition of the alliance's importance is also written into the strategic documents of each of the three Baltic states. If you look at Lithuania's strategic provisions, right under the importance of maintaining a strong army is a section on the importance of reliable collective defence commitments. A section which starts with the words, quote, "The security of NATO members is indivisible. A threat to the security of one member of the alliance is a threat to the security of the alliance as a whole. A strong and united alliance, ready to ensure the security and defence of its members, is an important interest of Lithuania's defence policy." End quote. You'll find a similar focus in Latvia and Estonia. And indeed, in Estonia's 2011 defence strategy, when describing the two pillars of Estonia's defence strategy, The promotion of international security and the credibility of NATO's collective defence mechanism actually came before the strengthening of Estonia's own initial defence capability. And in part, that's because when you dig into the practicalities of Baltic defence strategy, to a great extent, NATO is always part of the answer. They can design armed forces that might hold the Russian military for a while, but they can't hold them forever. They can try and offer conventional deterrence, but they rely on NATO for their nuclear umbrella. And their forces are so specialised in that homeland defence, ground combat role, that they would almost certainly have massive problems against an opponent like the VKS, unless supported by Allied air forces and Allied air defences. So let me ask you a question from a strategic standpoint. If your defence strategy relies on an alliance letting you in and then coming to help you out if things ever get rough, firstly, how do you make sure that they let you in? And secondly, how do you make it maximally likely that if you ever have a situation where the beacons have been lit and the Baltics call for aid, the various heavy hitters of NATO are quick and decisive with their answer? One method the Baltic States seem to have leaned on is to try and get the team serious about them by proving how serious they are about the team. Despite their limited populations and resources, troops from the Baltic States have deployed on multiple NATO exercises and missions. And after the September 11 attacks in 2001, all three Baltic republics would commit troops to the operations in Afghanistan. And as one report put it, quote, "When measured per capita, the Baltic States did suffer one of the highest ratios of deaths per head among coalition partners." When talking about the casualties taken by Estonian forces in Afghanistan, the report noted, quote, "This is primarily due to the fact that they had volunteered to serve with no operational caveats in some of the most hostile combat areas, a type of environment where few NATO members wish to see their armed forces deployed," end quote. Basically, in a situation where some contingents were turning up and saying, hey, send us where it's safe, these guys rocked up and asked to be sent where they were needed. And the contribution is all the more telling when you take account of the fact that the deployments weren't universally popular at home, and that the three Baltic states didn't actually get to join NATO until March 2004, meaning they essentially went about honouring alliance commitments before they actually had any. But the contribution was likely very much a calculated one in order to build alliance cohesion. As the Estonian president of the time put it when asked why Estonian citizens had to fight in Afghanistan or Iraq, he reportedly responded that an Oklahoma farmer might ask a similar question. Why should their son fight, if necessary, somewhere in Estonia or Latvia? Thus, the logic as he expressed it was pretty clear. Quote, "If we want to be helped when we need help, we must be ready to help our allies." End quote. The gamble, essentially, was that Americans would remember the effort and sacrifice. Moving on to approach 2, many of the Baltic states have sought to closely integrate their forces with other NATO ones, not just by participating in training exercises and practicing operating alongside each other, but actually writing each other into the same force structures. Estonia, for example, is working towards having a regular division which features a British brigade, while Lithuania and Germany have signed an agreement to have a permanently stationed German brigade in the country by 2027, which will presumably be written into the defence plan of the country, with Lithuania providing a lot of the infrastructure and support. It feels like these sort of combined or intertwined formations are becoming more common in NATO of late. Germany and the Netherlands, for example, maintain a combined core. But pulling these sort of arrangements and formations together isn't quick, painless, or easy. Infrastructure needs to be established, relationships need to be built, and then you just need time to get units moved, based, and then training together. But if you get it right, it might start to look like the Baltic states are defended less and less by units from those respective countries, and more by NATO formations. Which leads into point 3, where nations like the Baltic states tend to advocate for more forward-positioned NATO forces, with the political spectrum there ranging from Russia, which obviously doesn't want any additional NATO troops in the Baltics, through to the Baltic states themselves that would probably be happy if you decided to rebase the entire British army in Estonia, the Bundeswehr in Latvia, and then maybe had France and Italy draw straws to see who got to go to Lithuania. Conceptually, and note that I am oversimplifying here, you can think of NATO's force levels in the Baltic states as falling into one of 3 main categories. During the periods of relatively minimal NATO presence in the Baltics, the forces stationed there can basically be described as tripwire forces, where maybe you set up some small forward logistics bases and continuously rotate through small units, so that at any given time, maybe there are a couple of hundred American or British troops facing off against the Russians in the Baltic states. And that, essentially, is your deterrence plan. This is not in fact because American, British or French troops are meant to be so badass that a few companies of them are meant to be able to hold off the entire Russian army with nothing more than bravado pecs and a Call of Duty headshot montage. Instead, if you're in a tripwire force, congratulations, your purpose in life is to deter an opponent by threatening them with the prospect of you dying horribly. The idea here is that by putting troops from major countries in the Baltic States, Russia would be aware that it couldn't invade successfully without engaging those troops and causing American, British or French casualties, which would presumably cause outrage in the countries that those troops came from, and increase the odds that they would then find some very painful and kinetic ways to express that outrage. Tripwire forces were attractive because they were relatively cheap, and also because it would be very difficult to argue that they pose a security threat to Russia. If Putin were to stand up and say that a couple of hundred NATO troops with no heavy equipment posed a significant security threat to Russia, it would kind of be a bit of an indirect cell phone on the fighting qualities of the Russian army. The issue, obviously, with tripwire forces is they don't have much combat value and they don't always work. The UK had a tripwire force in the Falklands in the 1970s, but the Argentinians invaded anyway. So the new standard, as of early 2022, which I've got on screen there, was called NATO's Enhanced Forward Presence. Under this model, the number of ready reaction NATO forces was increased, the number of troops deployed to the eastern flank of the alliance similarly increased, and total NATO forces, not including host nation forces in the Baltic States, increased to about 8,000 personnel. And for some unknowable reason, there's been significant push in the Baltics to increase the scale of deterrence forces further, to the point where you have those permanently stationed NATO brigades, like the German brigade we talked about earlier, permanently stationed and integrated into the relevant defence plans. But you could argue the broader debate over how many NATO troops and what NATO troops to station in the Baltic and whether they should be permanent or rotational is really just a symptom of a broader strategic debate over how NATO should deter an attack on its Baltic flank. One school of thought, basically deterrence by punishment, is that you don't actually have to defend the territory of the Baltic states themselves from any initial attack. Instead, the deterrence takes the form of the adversary knowing that even if they take a lot of this territory initially, eventually the NATO counterstrike is going to arrive and it's going to hurt. The competing school of thought, deterrence by denial, says that the way you deter an opponent is by preventing them taking their objective in the first place, and that what you have to do is concentrate enough military force in the Baltic states or nearby ready to quickly reinforce that Russian planners were never confident in their ability to quickly overrun one or more of the Baltic states. Some political leaders, especially in Estonia, have been very vocal in supporting option 2. Estonia's Prime Minister, for example, came out and said that under existing NATO planning, essentially, her country would be expected to endure up to 180 days of Russian occupation before a NATO counterattack force could kick them out of the country. That would mean both a protracted Russian occupation and then additional battles being fought potentially in Estonian urban centres. And as we've seen at places like Marinka, like Bakhmut, when the Russian army fights a protracted battle over an urban agglomeration, you shouldn't expect a huge amount to be left standing in the end, leading to what she described as a situation where Estonia was essentially wiped off the map. I should note that not all Baltic leaders publicly endorsed the idea that it could take 6 months to throw the Russians out of their countries in the event that war broke out. But for planners in Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, the strategic imperative of trying to avoid an occupation is probably very real. In essence, they don't want to be avenged, they want to be defended. The other threat, less often talked about publicly, is that if the Baltic states were ever overrun, there's always an admittedly small but non-zero chance that NATO wouldn't actually come to the rescue. That maybe a combination of nuclear threats, escalation risk, international pressure, and maybe an internal spoiler or two within the NATO and European security architecture might lead to calls for a ceasefire or accepting a frozen conflict that left all or part of one of the Baltic nations under occupation. You've seen Baltic leaders take some notice of voices within NATO saying that Ukraine, for example, should surrender some of its territory in exchange for peace. And so if they have even the slightest fear that in the future they might be asked to do the same, then there's a strategic imperative in place to make sure they have enough forces available locally to make fairly sure that none of their reasonably limited national territory ever ends up on the wrong side of a trench line. Just about all the narrow range of scenarios that might allow Russia to score a win in a Baltic scenario rely on it moving quickly, seizing territory and then negotiating from a position of strength. And so you'll generally see the Baltic states advocate for defensive approaches that aim to stop any invasion or hybrid war operation more or less at the starting line. And over the last 2 years, we've seen that strategy manifest in two distinct foreign policy positions: strong support for Ukraine and a pretty firm stance on the topic of expanding NATO's membership. I mean, it's impossible to be entirely sure what the Estonian government thought of Finland joining NATO, but the fact they lit up their government building with the Finnish flag might provide us all a subtle clue. As might the fact that the Baltic States were some of the loudest advocates of getting Finland and Sweden into NATO, once Vladimir Putin kicked off his NATO recruitment campaign in earnest. The historical precedent here was probably particularly strong for Estonia. Finnish volunteers played a significant role in Estonia's War of Independence after the First World War, while a number of Estonians in turn fought with the Finns against the Soviets in the 30s and 40s. Basically, these are two nations, two militaries that go way back, and they were probably happy to finally be in the same clubhouse together. And in terms of strategic impact on the vulnerability of the Baltic States, Finland and Sweden joining is arguably actually a very significant boost. To illustrate the point, go back to that scenario that was considered by those Rand war games earlier. Russia sets up some sort of covering circumstances and then tries to quickly overrun the northern two Baltic states. Now, reconsider that scenario, but this time factor in Finland and Sweden being parts of NATO. And instantly, you can probably see that three major things have probably changed. Firstly, Russia now has a massive flank open along the border with Finland. And so Russian military forces probably want to make sure that flank remains covered and account for the fact that you might have things like airstrikes being generated from Finnish airfields. In the Rand scenario, NATO aircraft were probably taking off from runways in places like Poland. Now, the sorties could be generated in Sweden or Finland as well. The second thing that changed was just how many NATO forces are effectively based somewhere where they could meaningfully influence a conflict in the Baltic. For most NATO powers, being able to exert a military presence in the Baltic means going through the expense of forward positioning units. But if you're the Finnish army or the Swedish Air Force, you don't really need to forward position to be relevant in that scenario. Your country, your permanent bases are already close enough to make an impact. And once you factor that in, the numbers involved are far beyond what we've seen from NATO's enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states so far. This isn't about Russia having to consider the potential impact of an extra German or British brigade on their plans. The Finnish Defence Forces have a wartime strength of about 280,000. And when you're talking about air power, these are countries that can deploy Gripen with Meteor, FA-18 Hornets. And from roughly 2026, Finland's going to have an F-35 force as well. So from the point of view of this sort of Baltic scenario, the impact of adding Finland and Sweden to the alliance isn't so much just about the military capacity they bring, it's the point they bring it in just about the perfect place. Which links into a third point that's also tied to the deterrence picture. As we discussed earlier, the Russian calculus in this sort of scenario isn't just about how powerful NATO is, it's about how the alliance is likely to respond. And if you put countries on a spectrum based on how likely they are to go and assist Estonia, Latvia or Lithuania if they're ever attacked by Russia, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that countries like Finland would be deeply invested in making sure that that sort of Russian military operation failed. And that matters not just for determining what forces are likely to be committed and make a difference in any potential campaign, but also what some of the political and diplomatic dynamics within NATO are likely to be. With every voice you add to the alliance saying that every inch of NATO territory has to be defended, the less likely it might be, all else being equal, that the alliance chooses to adopt a strategy of backing down. So taking all that together, you could argue that by advocating for Finland and Sweden to come into the NATO tent, you could argue the Baltic states have done a lot to help make sure that if the Russian military is ever turned against them, they're capable of resisting it. But at the same time, they're also investing a lot of political capital, money and effort in making sure the Russian military is never in a position to get to that point. Which brings us to what the Baltic governments probably regard as the greatest geopolitical crisis they're currently facing, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And on that topic, all three governments have been pretty clear where they stand. The Latvian president has said that it's important that Vladimir Putin fails in Ukraine. Estonia's prime minister has described the conflict in essentially existential terms. And Lithuania's foreign minister is reportedly on record challenging a lot of the rhetoric that has come out of many NATO countries. Reportedly saying, quote, "It would be good," speaking about the messages to Putin, "to commit not just to as long as it takes, but change it to victory and whatever it takes. I think that's a very strong deterring message to Vladimir Putin," end quote. In part, that might be because the Baltic states have expressed the view that were Vladimir Putin to be victorious in Ukraine, he would be highly likely to set his sights a little further. Kallas has said that, quote, "If Ukraine falls, it's going to be all over for Europe," end quote. while the Lithuanian foreign minister expressed it as follows, quote, "Are we deterring or are we inviting him?" in reference to Putin. And this is where the anxiety of the Baltic states and most likely Poland comes from. The problem is, we don't feel Putin is being deterred enough, end quote. So essentially, their assessment seems to be that Russia needs to be defeated, and it needs to be defeated in Ukraine. To make that happen, the Baltic states have dug very deep when it comes to military and financial aid for Ukraine. If you look at a leaderboard of the largest donors to Ukraine in nominal US dollar terms, you won't see the Baltic states at the top of that list. Donors with much broader financial shoulders, like the United States, European Union, or countries like Germany, are always going to lead a list on those sort of measures. But in percentage terms, when measured against the kind of resources they have available, according to the Kiel methodology, which I've talked about before and should come with some caveats, Estonia has donated 4.1% of its GDP, Lithuania 2%, and Latvia 1.7%. To put that into perspective, if the entirety of the European Union and the United States had matched Estonia's bilateral aid percentage share of GDP, 3.6%, then the total sum of aid to Ukraine would have been something like 1.8 trillion US dollars, or about 100% of Russia's nominal GDP. It would also have left the Ukrainian armed forces funded about as well as the US military, and I'm fairly confident saying, probably would have resulted in some very, very different military outcomes. To put some numbers around the direct military aid, noting I will link the source in the description, it's estimated that the Baltic states account for just over 60 towed howitzers going to Ukraine, about 14% of the total, 18 self-propelled guns, including Latvian M109s and Lithuanian 120mm mortar carriers, a pair of surface-to-air missile launchers and Mi-8 helicopters from Lithuania, hundreds of various ground systems, plus ammunition, supplies and support. And all of this is before you count initiatives by private citizens. Like the time Lithuanian citizens essentially crowdfunded a Bayraktar TB2. Some of the Baltic states have also played significant logistics and support roles. In 2022, Lithuania was at the forefront of getting PZH-2000 self-propelled guns that had been donated to Ukraine, repaired and back in action. And just about any time any of NATO's allies have advocated for more support for Ukraine or fewer restrictions being placed on the donated systems, almost inevitably you'd find the Baltic states throwing their support behind the idea. When Paris faced opposition for suggesting that they couldn't rule out sending NATO troops into Ukraine, the Baltic states backed up that position. When Ukraine has asked for new classes of weapon systems, the Baltic states have usually suggested that they should get it, and figures like Estonia's president are on record saying that when Ukraine is provided with Western weapon systems, there shouldn't be any restrictions on those systems being used against targets in Russia. In essence, while you can have some voices in the European Union or NATO, like Hungary for example, that always seem to be pulling back on the idea of more assistance for Ukraine, the Baltic states have often been at the forefront of pushing for more to be done. While some nations have been relatively coy or non-committal about what they think NATO's objective should be for the war in Ukraine, the Baltic states have generally been far clearer in calling for a Russian defeat and a Ukrainian victory. Estonia actually went even further and published a strategy on how they think it can be done. And it isn't a strategy based on the hope that a new wonder weapon will come along to win the war, or the hope that the existing sanctions regime will be enough for Moscow to call the whole thing off. Instead, it relies on elements like winning the industrial race, signalling the willingness to fight a long war, and raising the pain level for Russia until it becomes, quote, intolerable for the Kremlin, end quote. Obviously, the decision to publish a strategy like this doesn't indicate that it's going to be taken up by NATO or the European Union. But what it does give us is insight into how countries like Estonia see the war in Ukraine, how they want to see it end, and how they view it as relating to their own security. As that strategy puts it, quote, should Russia prevail in this war within the next 12 to 18 months, it would validate its assumptions about our collective weakness that can be militarily challenged and exploited in the short term. End quote. The overwhelming security objective for these states is to prevent another invasion and another occupation. And while that touches on elements like investing in their militaries, reinforcing NATO's membership and cohesion, and preparing their societies to respond should the worst happen, it also expands to the ideas of the war in Ukraine essentially being the front line of their own strategic defensive efforts. And so I think it'll be very interesting to see how those interests manifest throughout the rest of 2024. The course of the war in Ukraine might be dominated by decisions made in Kyiv, Moscow or Washington DC. But despite their limited resources, given their rather unique historical and strategic motivations, I wouldn't want to underestimate the potential impact of these three small states on the Baltic Sea. And okay, channel update to close out. The video this week was originally going to be on a different topic chosen by the patrons, but for various reasons I did have to change it around. Frankly though, I'm glad I did, because I've been talking about discussing the Baltic States for more than a year at this point. I know people generally love it when I talk about major military powers, but sometimes I think it's important to look a little bit closer and see just how some of the smaller countries out there sometimes really can move the needle on major strategic issues. Regarding future releases, there'll be a long-term topic poll going up for the patrons in the coming week, but I will say that after serious consideration, I've decided we probably won't be doing an April Fool's Day release. Purun Gaming is also going to be on hiatus at least for a little bit longer. I should have a new system ready to go relatively soon, but we'll see. As always, let me just extend my thanks to all of you. And particularly, thank you for all the support the video on the arms sector got last week. A good reception always feels great, but it feels even better when it's on a data-centric video. So with my thanks to all of you and of course today's video sponsor, I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I'll see you all again next week.